Hi again, guys. Sorry I had to change location because my kid arrived home, and when my kid gets home, the piece is over. So I had to change location. But let's go again to the point where we were. We were in chapter 5. Chapter 5 of this book is structure and character. Structure and character talks about how to build the character and how the character is important to the structure. So McKee talks about McKee makes distinctions between character and characterization of a certain character. Characterization is all the things that we can describe this character. So his age, his sex, if he's rich, poor, how he dresses, what kind of car he has, what job he does. So all that belongs to characterization. And McKee separates characterization with true character or personality, and true character, we can only show it through the actions and through decisions that this character is going to take when put into situations of conflict and pressure. So, to express true character, we have to show it in situations of conflict and in situations where the character needs to take a decision. That's where his true personality comes out. And the work that we need to do here is, of course, when we define the story, we will define how the character is, and then we should search for the best characterization that gives more power to this character. Basically, this is what McKee is trying to say. So going through the chapter, we have headings like the character revelation, which means characterization is how we describe the character in the beginning, but true character, it's revealed throughout the story and can even change throughout the story. And that change comes after with character arc. Character arc is the evolution of the character. A character can start being a good guy and being a bad guy, for example. Climax and character. McKee says that stories about character transformation, when the character is put under pressure, under dilemmas, when the character needs to make decisions and how he's going to act on those decisions. That's what reveals true character. And of course, there is a huge connection between character and climax. Character and climax. Now we arrive to chapter number 6. Chapter number 6, it's called Structure and Meaning. And by meaning, McKee means what I was explaining already before. It's your main idea. What do you want to say with your story? What is the meaning? What is the controlling idea? Robert McKee defines this meaning as the controlling idea of the story. So, what is the main idea, the theme? By other authors, call it the theme, or what do you want to show the audience? What is your story about? So, basically, uh, McKee says that you should have an idea, and how this idea is gonna affect the structure. This is why this chapter is called Structure and Meaning, is because you should structure your story always with the extremes of this idea. So, to make an example, if you're making a story about love, then to make it more powerful, you should use positive feelings like love, but and also negative feelings like hate. So you should always work with the idea and the counter idea. So in this chapter, he also covers idea and counter idea. So you can always move from plus to minus and plus to minus, and this is how you progress your story forward. These are, of course, general ideas. This book is trying to, McKee always tries to tell you what you should think when you are thinking of your story, how you should face screenwriting in this, or in this case, plotting. This is always, he never goes too much into specific how you should make things, but it's giving you the fundamentals, the idea to do it. This was part two of the book, and now we enter part three. Part three, which is called The Principles of Story Design. Principles of Story Design. Let's start with chapter number 7, The Substance of Story. Chapter number 7 starts by talking about the protagonist and the how important the protagonist is and how it should be. So we have some notes from McKee. Uh, Basically, he says a protagonist is a willful character. Willful means that a protagonist needs to have a desire, needs to take action. He needs to want something. He cannot be someone that has no want or no need. It needs to want something. The protagonist has a conscious desire. There we go again. The protagonist may also have a self contradictory unconscious desire. We covered this in school as well. Moral need and objective need. So, what you want and what you really need. The protagonist has the capacities to pursue the object of desire convincingly. The protagonist must have at least a chance to attain his desire. By this, McKee means that when our protagonist has a desire, of course he needs to have a chance to achieve that. It doesn't mean that your story, at the end he needs to achieve what he wanted, but at least you need to come close to it. If you want to make a story with a negative ending, then he needs to come close to his goal, and at the end he loses it. Or if the story is of course uh, coming to a positive ending, then it's the other way around. But he needs to have a chance to achieve what he wants, and what it cannot happen is you cannot have a character that wants something and never does anything to get it, or never has the chance to do what he wanted, right? Then the story is a bit awkward. The protagonist must be empathetic. He may or may not be sympathetic. Okay? Sympathetic is a person that you like. Many characters you like it immediately. You don't necessarily need to like your protagonist, but he needs to be empathetic. And by empathetic, that means that you need to identify yourself with the character. You can even have a bad character. You can have like a criminal, but you need to kind of identify yourself. If you look at a movie and your protagonist is a bad guy, then the audience must feel like, okay, if I would be a bad guy, I would act like him, or I would understand his choices. This is what empathetic means. He goes on to describe the audience bond. Audience bond is exactly what I've explained. So your protagonist needs to bond with the audience. The audience follows the movie through your main character's point of view. So there needs to be a bond, even if the character is a bad guy, but it needs to be a bond. He also points out the world of a character. The world of a character is, of course, his backstory, his daily life, how is his world like, and again he refers to really go deep into your characters, and to understand your character's world, you need to put yourself in the position of your character, and you need to know yourself. You need to know your character very well. Okay, the three levels of conflict that I've mentioned already before are explained in this character. Are explained in this chapter. So we have inner conflict, the conflicts that happens with the character itself. Then we have personal conflicts that happen with people who are close, friends, family, and so on. And then we have extra personal conflicts, which are conflicts with other forces like society and so on, or nature, for example. He refers at the gap. I've mentioned this already before as well. Gap is the space that there is between the character's expectation and the end result. And this is the space who moves the story all forward and forward. So the character enters a scene wanting something, and exits the scene with something different that he wanted. Usually, of course, it's not always like this, but this is the main idea. So this is the gap that is between the character expectation and the result that he gets, and this, because it's different, then this promotes always a consequence, and this consequence promotes the next scene, and the next scene promotes the next one. So he refers at this gap between expectations and result, and he says that the story moves throughout throughout one gap to another, one gap to another, and it increases in intensity and increases in what is at risk, and increases on pressure on decision making and dilemmas for the main character, and that's how he transforms his personality. There we go. He goes on talking about the risk, the gap in progression, what I've just explained, one gap after the other provokes progression of the story. Writing from the inside out, we check that out as well. From the inside out, we need to really define the main plot points and what is the story about. It's more important than just have a few scenes and trying to build a story around those scenes. That's not how McKee would say that a true screenwriter works, but you have to work on story first, then step outline, and only then you can start writing whatever you want to write. Throughout this book, McKee always uses a lot of examples of movies for every single chapter, for everything that he's trying to explain. He always uses examples with movies, which really helps. As the book dates 1998, most of the movies are, at least what for me I consider a bit older movies, but nonetheless, all of them classics and movies that we should know and see probably. But if you are not much into old movies, or if you haven't watched many, I suggest you watch at least Casablanca, Jaws, Chinatown, and Kramer versus Kramer, as I believe those four movies are the ones McKee refers more and more often, over and over again. So at least those two. Of course, he refers to many others. I think probably 100, but those four, they come in almost every chapter. They keep on coming. So those are the main movies. If you can have a look at them before reading this book, would be great. Still in this chapter about structure, chapter number 7, we have a very good example what it means to write from inside out, and it's an example of a scene from Chinatown, and McKee kind of makes an X-ray of this scene, and you go to kind of the thinking of the character. So because McKee says when you're writing a scene, you should put yourself always into the character's mind. So he's going through this Chinatown scene, and he's writing between the lines what probably the characters are thinking, and then you read the dialogue. So it's really interesting to see how to do this process of writing from inside out. Chapter number 8 talks about the inciting incident, a very important point in the story, according McKee. The second most important point after the climax. Climax and inciting incident have to be connected. He writes, for example, the inciting incident radically upsets the balance of forces in the protagonist's life. So this is a very nice image that he has here. As you can see, minus plus. So this is the life of the character before the inciting incident, and when the inciting incident happens, then his life needs to take. It can be a positive inciting incident, like winning the lottery, for example, or negative, someone dies or something bad happens. But the inciting incident needs to be an event that pushes the character out of his daily life. It's an event that pushes the character and gives him the need of doing something, the need of achieving something new, and he needs to get out of his normal life and starts this quest, which is coming next. McKee goes on to talking about the spine of the plot. Spine of the plot is just the path that the character goes from inciting incident into climax, following his object of desire. So what he's saying is like when an inciting incident happens, then it happens also some kind of desire. So for example, if you win the lottery, then your desire is buying the best car in the world, and there you go in your quest, trying to find your desire, trying to find which one is the best car in the world. This was just an example. So the following this desire is the spine of the plot. Then he goes on to talk about the quest. The quest, of course, is the journey that we are taking from inciting incident into climax. And this journey progresses through conflict in that can be in those three levels that we saw: inner conflict, personal conflict, extra personal conflict. And those conflicts are always in between the object of desire that he wants to reach. So this quest, it's a constant uh, it's a constant fight back and forth from positive feelings to negative feelings, pressure, dilemmas, always trying to get to the object of desire and getting these forces of antagonists slowing you down and creating all this conflict. So this is what story is about. Another heading of this chapter reads locating the inciting incident, and this means where in the time of the movie should the inciting incident comes, after 10 minutes, after 20 minutes. And here McKee says that it really depends, but he says that inciting incident is the thing that should hook the audience into the story. So in one way it should happen as soon as possible, but on the other hand you should wait for the right moment for the inciting incident to happen, because the moment should be right. The moment should be there where the audience is ready to receive this inciting incident. So I believe if a movie just starts with an inciting incident, it could happen, but in some cases it might be, depending on the inciting incident, you might have to explain a bit of the character world before the inciting incident makes sense. In other cases, maybe the inciting incidents could be immediately as the movie starts. That could happen as well. But another thing that he mentions as well is inciting incidents from subplots. So, and he says if the inciting incident of your main plot happens a bit too late in the movie, let's say after 25 or 30 minutes, then it's too much of a time in the beginning. If you need to structure that way, then you should find some kind of subplot that has an earlier inciting incident in there, so that the story doesn't lose the rhythm. Chapter 9 is about act design. Act design talks about the structure of the plot, the structure of the acts, basically. So he goes on talking things about progressive complications. So through crisis and complications is how there is progression in the story. Points of no return. So plot. McKee says that a plot should be made of a series of points of no returns. So after a few scenes, there is this big decision, a point of no return. After that decision, you can't go back. You have to keep on going after another point of no return, and so on. So he says a story must not retreat to actions of lesser quality or magnitude, but move progressively forward to a final action beyond which the audience cannot imagine another. So he keeps on saying this same idea as well, which is after the climax, the story has to conclude in a way that the audience should not be thinking that a different ending could be possible. Okay, when a story ends, it's like, okay, it should be like a great revelation for the audience, and the audience must be kind of overwhelmed with the way we told our plot and we guide them there. If we arrive to a climax where the audience is like, but I thought this should have gone the other way, or this was not so convincing, then we have a problem there. So in this chapter, he talks as well about the law of conflict. Then he goes on to explain complication versus complexity, and it's very easy. A complication is just something that happens in one of the levels of conflict of a character. So a complication could happen at a personal level, inner level, or extra personal level. But the complexity is when we mix, when we have things happening in all the levels at the same time. So this adds great depthness and dimension to our character, and consequently to our story as well. In this chapter, McKee goes on to kind of show more or less the timings of the acts. How long should Act One be, Act Two, and where the inciting incident should be placed in that time frame, and how you can work with the subplots as well on it. And he makes a note here which says the multiplication of acts, climaxes invites cliches. So this is one of the reasons in this chapter is explained why he thinks that the three act structure actually works really well, because the more acts we add, then the more turning points or climaxes we need. Every act has like a climax or of its own. So if we have a story with too many acts, like 7 or 8, then you have so many climaxes, and you end up in a temptation of using more cliches because there is so much material. Where if you just have 3 acts, then it's safer and it's clearer how to make a nice structure that climaxes in a more satisfactory way and with more impact. So the more acts we have in a story, then kind of the last impact seems to lose a bit of power. That's his idea. Okay, he goes on talking about false endings, which he, in his opinion, can be tricky. So false endings is when you climax and you show something, but then it wasn't like that. It could work really well in some kind of genre, but it's in others. It might you might deception the audience with a false ending. Can be tricky in his opinion. Subplots and multiple plots that we talk about already. You can have those subplots. They all have as well an inciting incident, a climax, and a resolution. And he goes on to describe how you can use subplots. Actually, a subplot can contradict your controlling idea. So this is why we use subplots, is so we have an opportunity. If you have the main story is about a love story, then you could have a subplot that it's a love story that doesn't work. If the main story works and it's a happy ending, then you could have a subplot with a love story that actually doesn't work, and this adds more depth and dimension to your idea. So the subplots are there whether to contradict the main controlling idea of your story, or then to reinforce in order to show different perspectives of it. So if you're trying to get something stated out there, you're trying to show something to the audience, then you have a subplot to show the same thing maybe from a different perspective. And he says also a subplot may be used to complicate the central plot. And when the central plot inside an incident must be delayed, a setup subplot may be needed to open the storytelling. This is what I've just explained before. If you have your inciting incident too late in the movie, then you might need like a subplot to start your story somehow. Chapter number 10 is about scene design. McKee says this chapter focuses on the components of scene design, which are turning points, setups, payoffs, emotional dynamics, and choice. And then later he analyzes. The next chapter is scene analysis, and we're going to go through these points as well. So turning points, of course, the turning points of your plot. Your plot have many turning points, like the inciting incident, midpoint, and so on. So those turning points are very important for the overall design of your scenes. Then he goes on to talk about setups and payoffs, something that we saw already in our master's class, and we call them planting. So here is the same thing: set up, pay off, something that you show earlier, and then you go and get it later again. Emotional transitions, which means this constant process of going from negative to positive. In McKee's point of view, there is only two kind of emotions: positive or negative ones, as I explained before. And this progression in story is a constant changing from positive to negative, from positive to negative. This is what creates conflict. This is what creates dilemma. This is what creates progression. Okay. And later on, another point that he goes to talk is the nature of choice. Choice is, of course, the decisions that characters needs to take when they are faced with a dilemma, and these decisions are the ones who provoke progression as well. So these emotional transitions and these decisions are the one who will define how the scenes are going to flow, and this is the scene design. Chapter 11 is about scene analysis, and Robert McKee shows us a way that we can analyze a scene, and this helps us if we want to analyze any scene of any other movie, but mostly, of course, to analyze our own scenes. Okay, and he goes on to describe his technique of scene analysis. Step one: define conflict. Okay, this means search where the conflict is in the scene. So if we need to analyze a certain scene, we watch the scene and try to find out, okay, where is the conflict? Define conflict. Step two: note opening value. So after watching the scene, we define, okay, what was the opening value of the scene? When the scene started, did it have a positive value or a negative value in terms of emotions? Step three: break the scene into beats. So we talked before, what is a beat? A beat is action from a certain character. And of course, a scene can be made of several actions. Character A does something, character B answers something. Character A does something else, character B does something else, character A responds to that. So every single action of every single character is a beat. So we go on to break the scene into beats. Step four: note closing value and compare with opening value. So we arrive to the end of the scene and note which is the end value of this scene. Is it still positive? Is it negative now? And step five: survey beats and locate turning points. Last step: we go through all the beats, all the actions that happening in the scene, and we identify in all those actions where was the turning point. And after that, he goes on with two examples, two different scenes, and he goes into analyzing them. One scene is from the movie Casablanca. So he goes there to analyze one of these scenes. And the other scenes he analyzes is a scene through a movie called Through a Glass Darkly. Okay. Of course, this is one of those chapters that I was talking before that it gets a bit more technical. So he's giving some technical insights of how he does this, and okay, but generally in the book I found the book not to be that technical, but of course there is some parts where he's giving some technical details like this one, how to analyze a scene. Chapter 12, it's called composition, and Robert McKee compares the writing of a script with composing a song. So to compose a song, we need the different notes that we need to put them together. And now he refers to these notes for screenwriting as being unity and variety, pacing, rhythm and tempo, social and personal progression, symbolic and ironic ascension, and the principle of transition. Okay, so let's go through each one of these quickly. Unity and variety. Basically, he just says that in your story, there needs to be all the time a unity. So everything that you show in every scene needs to be united to the whole idea that you want to transmit, and nothing should be there just by chance or randomly. So there needs to be a unity. But at the same time, you need to be creative enough to show variety in the idea that you want to show. So it's unity and variety. Point number two is called pacing, and pacing is about how, so the pace that you show the progression, and you create the tension and the curiosity in the audience. So this pace, how you reveal things, it should change. If it's always the same, like if you create tension always a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more, it might get a bit too boring. So sometimes we are revealing things quick, sometimes we are taking things easier. This is pacing. On the other hand, rhythm, it's about the length of your scenes. So in here as well, if you have scenes always with the same length, it might get a bit boring, of course. So we should probably combine shorter scenes with longer scenes, also depending on the mood and how the plot is developing. So another point is expressing progression, and progression can be social progression. As we saw, the plot moves through progression. It can be social progression within in the impact of character actions into society. So the progression is the consequences that the actions of the character is having on the society, or we can have personal progression, which is the consequences that the character's actions are having in himself, in his character. And we have also symbolic ascension. Symbolic ascension is here, McKee is talking about symbolism in movies, and he refers to um, it's important the use of symbols in a movie. Those symbols can be something that we create ourselves in our plot. Sometimes we create something symbolic that goes throughout the movie. And sometimes we might take symbols that they have a meaning already, and we take that meaning inside our story. So these are the two options of symbols, and McKee calls it imaginary system. We're going to go through it a bit later as well. But this symbolic meaning also has an ascension throughout our plot and climaxes, of course. So this is also a way of progression and a way of composing our plot. Symbolic ascension. Ironic ascension, um, turn progression into irony. Ironic ascension is for those stories that don't end nor with a positive note or a negative one, but end on a irony note. And as McKee describes, it can be a positive irony. It's like he didn't get what he wanted, but that made him happy. So it's kind of both sides of the note, but it's kind of positive in the end. Or it can be a negative irony, which is he got what he wanted, but at the end that destroyed him, or he realized that it was too late when he got it. So it's kind of irony, but on a negative ending. So irony ascension is also important when we are composing our plot. If our plot has an ironic conclusion, ironic ending, then the ascension to this irony, it's one of the factors that we use to compose the story. Principle of transition, I've discussed it already. It's transition that goes from positive values to negative values all the time, and that goes from scene to scene. The last chapter of part three is crisis, climax, and resolution. Crisis, it's the crisis McKee defines as the moment, usually very near to the climax. It's the moment before the climax when the protagonist needs to make a really, really big decision. It's not to be confounded. It could be the lowest point. Some other authors use like this, the lowest point before climax. But crisis, McKee just says, is the point where the protagonist needs to make the biggest decision that will lead them to climax. This is crisis. Then he talks about crisis within the climax. So he says these 2 points can actually even be together. You could have the moment of decision being the climax of the story. So that could happen as well. But most of the time, there is a moment of decision before, and then the protagonist says, like, okay, this is my final decision. And then, chada, we go to climax, and then you get the end result. So this is how it normally happens. But he's saying that it could also, there could also be a crisis within the climax. Then he goes on talking about placement of the crisis, where it has to be, as I mentioned already a bit earlier, and so on. Design of the crisis, and the crisis decision must be a deliberately static moment. So basically, he wants to say with this that the crisis moment, this decision moment, is a very, very important moment in the movie. So you have to see it on screen. You have to have the scene where there is this crisis moment. You cannot just jump it and assume that it happens. It needs to be seen on screen. Then he goes on to talk about the climax. As I mentioned before, the most important thing for Robert McKee, it's the climax. So we should really, really work very well on it. He goes on describing everything about the climax and why is it so important. And then he talks about the resolution. Resolution is what it comes after the climax. Robert McKee says the story should end with the climax, but he explains why we need a resolution. And he says we need a resolution for three main reasons. One, we might have a subplot that couldn't, in theory, he says all the subplots should climax before the final climax. So all the sub stories should end before the main story ends. But if for some reason we couldn't do that, then we have the resolution moment to kind of get some of the subplots sorted out. Another reason for the climax is to let the audience kind of know the consequences or the results of that climax within society or within the circle of people that were related to it. So in the story we have many characters, sometimes not just the protagonist. So after the climax, the protagonist does his final decision and achieves what he wanted or not, And then sometimes we need the resolution, is that scene where we see the impact that the climax had on all other characters. So we see them all celebrating, or all we see their lives after climax. And if not those two, then he says that we need anyway a resolution, because the climax should be such an intense moment for the audience that they need a little bit time to breathe after that and to recover from this immense and beautiful and intense moment, which is the climax of our story. So, resolution to let them breathe before they leave the theater. And now we arrive to the fourth and last part of the book. So, the writer at work. Chapter 14 talks about the principle of antagonism. We know already a lot about antagonism. So, McKee says that antagonism forces are really, really important for a story. The principle of antagonism: a protagonist and his story can only be as intellectually fascinating and emotionally compelling as the forces of antagonism make them. So, as I mentioned before, the forces of antagonism have a very, very important role on the building of our story. He goes on explaining taking story and character to the end of the line. So now that we are talking about antagonism, he explains how can we take our story to the end of the line. And before as well, we were talking about controlling idea and the opposite of the controlling idea. So when we have a protagonist and we have an antagonism, we have to consider all the possible consequences and feelings that we can create on it. And he names like McKee makes an illustration which includes different levels of antagonism. So he says if our movie is about justice, then what is what is contrary to justice would be unfairness. So unfairness would be like a small degree of antagonism. The contradictory to justice would be injustice, but then what he describes as negation of the negation, it would be tyranny. So tyranny would be even worse than injustice. It would be the negation of the negation, the end of the line, how we can take this the furthest possible. So basically, this part is about knowing the forces of antagonism and knowing all levels of antagonism towards your protagonist and towards and against the idea that you want to show. And the reason we need all these levels is because with story progression, the decisions, the conflicts, the dilemmas, they need to be stronger and stronger towards climax. So it's good that we know all these different levels of antagonism. He goes on showing different or the same thing for other feelings. For example, if we're talking about loyalty, then the contrary would be just split allegiance. The contradiction would be betrayal, and the negation of the negation would be self betrayal to oneself. So he goes on saying both some examples like that. After that, we have a chapter called Exposition, and the main idea here is show, don't tell. Exposition is boring. We all know that, and but we need to expose some information. But what he's saying is every time, if we can say something without writing, it's much better. If we can show exposition together with conflict, it's always much better. We should avoid having a scene there just for pure exposition. Actually, he says that if a scene has only pure exposition, there is no conflict in it, then it shouldn't exist. So every scene should have always some conflict, and we should try to input the exposition in subtle ways that doesn't slow down the rhythm of our story. So show, don't tell. It's the first heading on the chapter on exposition. He goes on to talk about the use of backstory. So backstories are very important for us screenwriters to know what we're talking about, but then we have to select what is really, really just necessary to show the audience. The least the better, because backstory is again exposition. So he's writing here, powerful revelations come from backstory, previous significant events in the lives of the characters that the writer can reveal at critical moments to create a turning point. And then he goes on always with examples with movies. Here an example from Chinatown, for example. He talks also about flashbacks in this chapter. He considers flashbacks to be a way of exposition, of showing something. And again, the same rule applies. So he says if you're using flashbacks, at least use flashbacks where there are some conflict in it. So don't use just a flashback to show something that you need to show or to explain something, but use it for some degree of conflict as well. Then he goes on talking about dream sequences, and the dreams applies is the same principles like flashbacks. And then he goes on to montage, and this was interesting for me. He considers a montage to be a way of exposition as well, and he actually thinks because it's hard to show conflict when you do a montage. A montage is a series of quick cuts showing things happening. So, in his opinion, montage is exposition, and we should actually try to avoid it. And then he writes a bit also about voiceover narration. So, voiceover narration is a way of exposition as well. We see that in many movies. So, we see the image, and then the voice of the character is explaining what is happening, for example. So, this might slow down your story. He says you should always explain what is happening with images, not with voiceover narration. And voiceover narration can be used only in those situations that it's adding something powerful to the scene, like making a counterpoint. If you're showing something, but the narration is saying something else, that can be interesting. But if you're using the voiceover narration just to explain something, some kind of exposition, then you shouldn't do it. Chapter 16 is about problems and solutions. So he goes on the problem of interest. Problem of interest. So he goes on to describe how you have to keep the audience motivated and interested in your story all the time. So you use curiosity and you progress the plots and you increase the intensity of turning points and emotions. So he talks about mystery, suspense, and dramatic irony. These are all tools to keep this interest. In mystery, the audience knows less than the character. In suspense, the audience and characters know the same information. And in dramatic irony, the audience knows more than the character does. Okay, so different. These are three different, completely different kind of emotions into the audience actually. And with these three things, you can kind of control what kind of emotions you are putting into the audience, because when you're doing your plot, you have the possibility of deciding if you want to use mystery, suspense, or dramatic irony. That's a decision that you can do, and he explains what kind of emotion that those decisions provoke on the audience. He goes on to talk about the problem of surprise. Problem of surprise and surprise because surprise is when we are building the audience into believing something and then Chara surprise and we show something completely different. It can be dangerous, like I mentioned before. It needs to be done in a proper way. Audience doesn't like to be cheated. So if you have a cheap surprise, that's going to have a very bad and negative impact on your story. So surprises are dangerous. Problem of surprise. The problem of coincidence, again, as well, I've talked already before. Coincidence, if you use it, you need to allow time to explain why you've used that coincidence. If you just use coincidence by the sake of using, that's like cheating. That's like going the easy way. It's not going to work. Okay. First, bring coincidence in early to allow time to build meaning out of it. So if you use coincidence, you need to remove the meaning out of that coincidence. You can use it, but you need to then find a meaning on it. Second, never use coincidence to turn an ending. This is Deus ex machina, the writer's greatest sin. Okay? Never use coincidence in a climax. Never use coincidence in a turning point. Never use coincidence to explain something that the audience wants to be explained. Okay, and Deus ex machina is it's something that McKee describes coming from the past, from theater times, Aristotle's times, and in that time it was kind of normal and accepted in this dramatic place, in these theaters with many people, sometimes these very complex stories with a lot of things would happen, a lot of characters, and at the end, to solve all the problems together, some god would just come down to the stage and decide everything. So this is the when he mentioned Deus ex machina, he mentioned exactly this technique used many years ago in theaters, where a god would just come and solve all the problems out of nothing. So don't do that with your story. Don't use coincidence to solve problems. That's a no-no, uh, according to McKee. Moving on to the next problem, we have problem of comedy. So he describes here a little bit, if you are into comedy, what kind of problems you can encounter in comedy, and what you should try to. Moving on to the next problem, we have the problem of comedy. So if you are in the comic genre, this part of the chapter is talking about what kind of problems you can encounter in comedy and how to go over them. And he talks as well about comic design and the problem of point of view as well. What kind of effects we create in the audience when we use points of view. And by point of view here, he means the camera. So when we see the world from a character's perspective, what does that causes, and how what kind of problems we can encounter there and what we should avoid. The problem of adaptation refers to adapting novels into scripts. So McKee goes on describing that a movie is based of images, and when we make descriptions, we have to write things that we can see. So we cannot, for example, or we shouldn't write character A or B has been waiting for 5 hours, because there's no way of shooting that. That's not an image. Waiting for 5 hours is not an image. We have to describe images. We have to describe things that we see. What happens with novels is that they are written in prose, and they have a lot of thoughts on it, a lot of emotions, a lot of things that are going through the character's mind, and a lot of things that we can actually not shoot or not see. And this is what makes adaptations very, very hard. And actually, he says the more a novel happens inside some character's mind, the harder it is the adaptation of that novel to a movie. And this is how, and he goes into more details explaining how we can go around that as well. Problem of melodrama, and here Robert McKee says that many writers, to avoid being said that the script is too melodramatic, they avoid writing big scenes where there is intense feelings and where the action happens at a low pace. They try to avoid that, and they instead try to write more quicker sketches. But he says that the problem is, if you have a good reason to make a really long scene, and if the scene is meaningful and it's properly structured within the evolution of your story, then it's okay to write big scenes. There is absolutely no problem. Of course, if it's done wrongly or out of context, then yes, it's going to be very slow and maybe boring for the audience. So this is what he says with the problem of melodrama. The problem of holes. Problem of holes is when you leave things in a story that are not explained, or there are things that don't make, they have no logic. Okay, it could be as you could tell a story and then at the end the audience goes like, yeah, but that doesn't make much sense. So this is what McKee describes as a hole, and a hole can have a negative effect. And an example that he gives, and he's talking about holes as a problem and also how you can solve them. You can restructure them, and if you cannot remove the hole from your story, at least he says you should recognize that the hole is there. The example that he gives is with the movie Terminator, where the screenwriter John Cameron realized that there is a huge hole, a logic hole in the whole movie, which is at the end we have John Connor, who sends his lieutenant back to the past to fight Schwarzenegger, the Terminator, to save his mother, basically. But as the movie is done, of course, the mother got pregnant from his lieutenant, and of course John Connor knew that, or at least it happened so. So it's kind of something that at the end of the movie the audience would be thinking like, wait a minute, but if he knew that the mother would get pregnant and he's sending his lieutenant to the past to get his mother pregnant, and it doesn't make much sense, or what is happening here, then they did really well. The movie ends exactly with Sarah Connor making a audio recording and saying those same questions. Like he's saying, like, I don't understand. If you knew that he would be your father, then why? And then he says, but I guess I could lose. We could go crazy thinking about this, and that's it. So he just assumes the whole, basically. This is the example. So this part talking about holes, interesting as well. Chapter 17 is about character. It starts with the mind worm. Robert McKee says that when we are developing our characters, we have to really get inside their brain, like the mind worm. So we have to know how they think. We have to know them better than we know ourselves. This is something that Robert McKee says as well. Characters are have a stronger definition than human beings. Human beings, we are sometimes complicated. We change from one year to the next. We change our ideas. A character is something that makes this evolution in your plot, and you know it exactly where it begins and how it ends. So you can know your character better than anyone else, and you can know it even better than yourself, because it's a precise process that happens with your character, and you have to know that. You have to be inside your character brains. This is what he's saying. Characters are not human beings. By this, he means exactly what I've just explained. We human beings, we have complex feelings and situations, and we change from throughout our lives and our characters are not human beings. This is exactly what I've just explained. So a character has a strong definition how he was and how he is at the end, and that's it. A human being, we are just changing constantly, so we don't have a precise definition of how we were and how we will be. So this is the difference between characters and human beings. So remember, your character is not a human being, it's a character. It's made to belong to a movie. Character dimension, we talked already earlier. He goes again. He talks a bit again about character dimension. Cast design here, McKee says that all the characters in your story they should be designed based on the protagonist. So the protagonist is the main character, and he has a goal, and he has an exciting incident, and he has a quest that ends up in the climax. All the other characters in the story they have to serve him, whether they are there to show his strengths, whether they are there to show his weaknesses, but they are there for a purpose to serve the protagonist. This is what he explains in this part of the chapter. 3 tips on writing characters for the screen. Tip number 1: leave room for the actor. I love this tip because I'm not a big fan of writing things with a super degree of precision. So when he says here, leave space for the actor, he means that when you are writing dialogue or writing a description, you can leave space for the actor to make his own interpretation. Especially in dialogue, he's not McKee is not a big fan of us screenwriting writing all these little notes of how the character is behaving or how he's saying something in a particular way. But he says this is the job of the actor to find that out, to make the interpretation and makes his best interpretation out of of the dialogue. Fall in love with all your characters. It's another tip that he say when you are designing your characters. Don't put a character there just because he needs to do something and you're not really even interested on it. Every single character on your movie needs to be special for you, and you need to fall in love with him because ultimately you need to be inside his brain. Character is self-knowledge. And this is saying that everything you build a character on, you build it with your own knowledge. So if you build a villain, you build with what you know about being a villain, and you're probably going to build a villain that is going to do things that you would do if you would be a villain yourself. So character is self-knowledge. Then we arrive to the chapter 18 talking about the text. Dialogue. He says dialogue is not conversation. In normal conversation, we talk a lot of things. We say a lot of words with no order, no connection, because we are just there with friends or with whoever it is, and we can just use whatever words come to our mind. Dialogue, the writer puts a lot of time to select which words you are saying. Dialogue needs to sound normal, but it's actually very, very intelligent saying. And dialogue needs to be economic. So you have to cut everything that is not needed. That's how he says that dialogue is not conversation. Completely not. Dialogue is a highly selected pieces of conversation that you specifically select to be in there, whereas normal conversation is just anything that comes to your mind. McKee say McKee is a fan of short speeches. He's uh, says try to avoid monologues. Of course, movie it's about beats. It's about action reaction. So there's no need to have big monologues there. Of course, if you have a reason for a big monologue, it's okay. But these are just as he said in the beginning of the movie, these are not rules, are principles. So, as a principle, keep in mind that short speeches work better. The suspense sentence, he goes on, is when the actor waits a little bit until he says the final word. It can be powerful. The silent screenplay, he says the best dialogue is no dialogue at all. That's the best. If you can say something just by showing, do that. If every dialogue that you don't need, you can remove it from your script. This is what he's saying. Okay, the silent screenplay. Description. This was dialogue. Now we come to description. Putting a film in the reader's head. So when you describe, of course, here there is talent as well. Some people are really better in describing. Then we have an extra challenge in our case that we have to write it in English. But it's really about putting the movie into the reader's head. If you have this talent, best. But this is what you should try to do. And of course, remember that you can only write things that can be filmed. You can only write images. Vivid action in the now. So every time you write a script, you write it in the present sense. This is basic as well. And image systems. Image systems is what I've explained already before with symbolism. So when you're writing a plot, you can have a system of images, a system of symbols, a certain way, a certain photography that your movie have. It can be the way you decide the lightings. But I believe this is my personal opinion. This part of image system, it's very connected with the director as well. So the director has a big influence of what kind of image he wants to give to the movie. So this is not just for screenwriting. At least this little piece, in my opinion. And then to finish this chapter, he's talking about titles very shortly, just half a page talking about titles, and he's basically just saying that the title should have the main idea in it, or something about the main idea, or something about the main character. Okay, and if it doesn't have one or the other, if the title is completely different from anything, then it's a no title, and it has no function at all, but because it might lead the audience to the wrong idea. So you if you have a wrong title, then the audience might by seeing the title they might imagine something, and then when they see the story, something completely different. So that's a negative effect in there. Chapter 19, the last chapter of this book, is about a writer's method. Writer's method, McKee describes a bit how you should be writing in order to become a consistent and professional screenwriter. He compares writing from the outside in, which most of or many inexperienced writers do, which I explained before. You have some ideas, some scenes in your mind, and you start developing a story around these ideas and these scenes. That's what you shouldn't be doing. What you should be doing is writing from the inside out, and that means find the theme, find your controlling idea, what you want to show, find your climax. It's the most important part of the story, according to McKee. Find the inciting incident that leads us to that climax. Find the turning points. Develop the step outline. Okay. put most of your effort on the step outline. That's 75% or more of your work, according to McKee, and only then he goes on describing the method of from the step outline you should go to a treatment, because when you on the treatment you have a description of every scene, and in those descriptions you can see again if something is working or not, and if something to be changed. And and he describes it as a process that you go after the treatment. You might need to go back to the step outline, change a few things there again, update the treatment, and only when you have a very solid step outline and treatment, then you can start writing the script. And even when you're writing the script, when you put the dialogue, which is the last part of your work, even after when you put the dialogue, you can see that maybe this scene is not working the way you wanted, and you might have to go back to the treatment or even back again to the step outline. But this is writing from the inside out, considering the inside the core main turning points and step outline of your story, and then out being the final script. Whereas maybe inexperienced screenwriters write from outside in. They have a few ideas, nice scenes. They rush to the computer, they start typing and writing the script. And after that, they have to keep on fixing and fixing and fixing, and they don't really realize where the problem lies. And another problem of writing like this is that you might fall in love to those original ideas and scenes that you had, and they could actually be causing a problem, but you are unable to see that because you fall in love to them and you want to stick to that. So let's try to follow the professional way of doing according to McKee and write from inside out. That's it, guys. At the end of the book, we have the fade out with the little story that I read you already. So it was once again, it was a very, very, very nice and inspiring lecture and reading that I had. So I recommend to everybody. And thanks. That's all I had to say. It really helped me a lot. I feel I have a bit more, if not technical knowledge, like I said before, but definitely a bit more talent and a bit more insight on what screenwriting really means after reading this book. Okay, thanks a lot. See you.